India's Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping expected to hold bilateral talks on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit that kicks off this weekend. Trade talks will be a key item on that agenda as the event comes just 2 days after the U.S. raised tariffs on Indian goods now to 50%. Joining us, former U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman, now Council on Foreign Relations President. Good morning to you. Michael, we have spent the better part of the past several decades trying to keep India from being China's best friend. Given where we are in this tariff war, I imagine that they may be closer than farther apart after this meeting.
Well, I think you're right, Andrew. I mean, since really the Clinton administration, we have really changed the nature of the relationship between U.S. and India. And recent actions on tariffs have very much struck India by surprise to be among the highest tariffed countries in the world. India has always tried to play, all sides if they could. They're close to Russia and Iran. They're close to the U.S. They have a tenuous relationship with China. They're very worried on the economic front that all that excess capacity from China, if they get closed out of the U.S. and closed out of the European markets, may come and get dumped in India. And of course, they have a whole history of border disputes, military disputes in the Himalayas, among other issues. This is Modi's first trip to China in 7 years. And it's a direct reaction to the fact that U.S. imposed these tariffs. They don't feel they can rely on the United States as a strategic partner going forward. And they're exploring their other options, with China and the other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
So how much is this meeting an effort to effectively signal to the United States, you got to give us a better deal, otherwise we're going to make friends with your enemy?
India is a very proud country, and I think it is certainly sending the signal that it is not willing to be pushed around by the United States and not be treated as one of the worst economic partners of the United States, certainly. And so it's wondering why it's facing a 25% tariff because of the oil it's buying from Russia, where China, which buys more oil from Russia, is not facing such a tariff. And I think it is sending that signal, Andrew. Now, there are lots of issues between India and China, and I don't expect that those are going to get resolved anytime quickly, but it is a signal to the U.S. and a very important domestic political signal for Modi that they are not going to be taken for granted by the United States going forward.
Michael, I want to pivot a little bit to all of this Nvidia news and this idea of selling this sort of throttled version of a Blackwell chip, if you will, a less powerful version of a Blackwell chip to China. And how you think about that in the context of national security today, and this idea that we need to have our chips effectively powering and being the platform around the world and effectively pushing out via competition a Huawei, as opposed to keeping these chips to ourselves and potentially letting Huawei in, though their chips are not as good as the Nvidia ones?
Well, on one hand, I think we do want our chips and our technology to be the stack that countries around the world use. When they can choose between ourselves and a Huawei chip, which may be less expensive, it also may be less effective, we want them to choose the United States. And that's why the relationship, for example, with the UAE is potentially so important. When it comes to export controls, though, export controls is a very particular area of policy. It's a decision for the government to come in and say, this technology is so critical to our national security, we are not going to permit our adversaries and our competitors to have it. That has been the way export controls have been managed in the past. Now it seems to be sort of a trade chit, and that if we can trade away our national security interests in a particular chip in exchange for some other benefit with China, that's a very dangerous precedent to set, because when you make these decisions on national security, you also need to get allies and others involved. Allies' willingness to say to their companies, you cannot export, you cannot benefit from the global economy because national security trumps everything else. That's hard to say that if we then trade it away. So whether the H-20 or the Blackwell modified version is a threat to national security, that decision needs to be made on its own merits, and then we should decide whether we want China to have it or not. I think China's indicated, Andrew, it's going to develop its own chips, the most advanced chips it can possibly develop. It may be somewhat slower than the United States is, and maybe behind where the United States is, but it is determined not to be dependent on the U.S. So I'm less convinced that exporting our most advanced chips to China is going to prevent Huawei from developing their own competitive products.
Michael, I just wanted to bring it back to India with the question of sort of the long term, almost regardless of what happens on these tariffs and the relationship between India and China, which is a lot of issues to iron out, as you said. I don't think it's a simple kind of move of allegiance in that regard. But long term, do you think now that the trade routes that have been established post the sanctions placed on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine will remain forever now, that from now on, India and, of course, China will buy a lot of oil and gas from Russia, and that the genie's out of the bottle there for the rest of the West? They can't recontain that?
Well, look, I think India needs to import a lot of energy products. They're benefiting enormously from the price cap on Russian oil, and they have been reportedly using the oil imports from Russia, processing them there in India, and then selling them onward, including potentially to Europe, which is, I think, quite disturbing. And so I think those trade routes are significant. Now, global energy is a global market, and it can change quite quickly. But they need to get that energy from somewhere. And traditionally, they look to places like Russia, like Iran, to get oil over time, and they very much need that. So my guess is those routes will be well established for some time.
Michael, I hate to play ping pong with you, but I want to go back to Huawei for just a moment, because I've been thinking about this. How much do you think that the risk is around Huawei building out its own chip and us sort of pushing them out via competition in China specific, versus the sort of larger issue? And we saw this play out before with 5G technology, which is that all of a sudden Huawei and China could be seeding their technology in places like Africa and all over the world at much cheaper prices, and that is actually the long-term risk, not necessarily that somehow they're going to have technology that we're not. And the reason I raise this question is, here we are potentially saying, even to some companies like Nvidia, hey, if we're going to allow you to do this, we want a VIG, we want 15% of it. And it makes me think that we may be in a better place to actually say to an Nvidia, we don't actually want your money. What we want you to do is actually sell your product. Forget about China. We want you to sell your product into places like Africa and other places at much cheaper prices. We want you to effectively subsidize it so that actually you push. We want you to win that game against Huawei. That's actually more important to us.
Well, I agree with you. I think that is the important game for us to win. I think that's why the Trump administration pivoted when it came to, for example, a number of countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and said we want to partner with them in AI, including getting a lot of Nvidia chips and the U.S. tech stack into those markets, so that China would not ultimately dominate those markets. You could do the same in Africa. You could do the same in other parts of the world as well. And we saw from, as you said, the 5G Huawei experience, how hard it is to get countries to pull out, to rip out Chinese technology once they've implemented it, because it's cheaper as well. And so that is, I think, the key competition. Whether or not we can prevent China from developing their own chips for their own market, I think that's quite a different challenge. And I think President Xi has laid out quite some time ago that there are a series of technologies, including semiconductors, where they want to develop world-class capacity for China and potentially for the rest of the world. I don't think anything we're going to do is going to stop that. And just to your point, Andrew, we've gone from a world where we restrict technology for national security purposes to now having a 15% financial interest in selling it to our adversaries and competitors. That's just a very, very dangerous precedent to establish.